Okay, for today's session, we're going to be packing in a number of smaller topics. First, we're going to look at how to uncover and analyze your prior knowledge. Then we'll be looking at a reminder of some of the best practices for research that you've developed throughout the MYP. And then we'll be touching on how to develop rigorous success criteria for your product or outcome. So a lot of important topics today. Before we move to that though, just a reminder that when you're coming up with your goal and kind of finalizing things, which you should be at that stage, you want to ensure that your goal is highly challenging. It's a very important part if you want top marks, but it can also be quite difficult for students to arrive at. Understandably, what's difficult for some students might be quite easy for others and vice versa. So it's very important that you kind of justify how your goal is highly challenging for you. And even though, again, this is very personal, there are certain guidelines that I can provide you with to maybe help you check on where your goal is at. So if we look here, a basic goal would be a goal that just sort of focuses on what you want to do or what you want to make, focusing entirely on the product or outcome itself and not necessarily on why you're doing that. What's the purpose of what you're doing or what you're making? So that adding that purpose pushes it into a challenging goal. And then in order to kind of push to a highly challenging goal, you want to consider the multiple parts to your goal. This sort of signals that you're pushing for greater personal development and greater learning. And one of the tips that we sort of tell students is to consider how many verbs are in your goal. It's not necessarily true that more verbs equals more challenge, but it's a good way to sort of signal that you are doing multiple things by having those multiple verbs. So if we look at this chart I've set up on the next slide here for you, moving from a very basic goal of just simply designing your own summer clothing, if we move towards a challenging goal, well, now you're signaling that you're also doing research. You're going to research current fashion trends and then design your own summer clothing. So automatically there's an extra level of challenge there. And if you look at the highly challenging goal, you're researching not only the fashion trends, but you're also researching how to design patterns. That's that kind of multifaceted research that we want to see. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But then also you're not just designing summer clothing, you're also creating it and displaying it for the school community. Now, for some people who are maybe considering going down a similar route, this might seem entirely overwhelming. And that's okay, you don't necessarily have to push this far. You may not ever create the summer clothing. Maybe it's enough just to design it. Maybe that's highly challenging for you. But to add the extra element of display does add a degree of challenge that most students in the school could pull off. So some things to think about there when you're trying to finalize your goal. Moving on now to prior learning. This is an important part of the project, and identifying prior learning can be a bit challenging for students because, as I've mentioned before, the personal project is a time where you can move outside of specific subjects. But the IB does want to see that you are considering prior learning, and they define prior learning, as you can see here on the slide, as personal experience and subject-specific knowledge and understanding developed in school or in the world beyond the classroom. So the IB really wants to think, or to see that you are thinking about how has your previous subjects helped you to develop certain skills that you're going to be using in the development of the project. Maybe you've had help and experience with research skills, maybe giving presentations, etc. Or it might be really specific skills from an art class or a design class, etc. They also, though, want to see that you're thinking about understandings and that you've developed through personal experiences outside the classroom. So maybe you have experience with your family doing something that relates to your personal project, or maybe you're part of a club where you've developed some skills or practices that are going to help you in the development of this personal project. So again, to score top marks, which I know you all want to do, you need to identify that prior learning as well as the subject-specific knowledge and make sure that it's consistently highly relevant to the project. So you want to be linking it in and discussing how it's going to help you, which aspects of your project is it going to help you with. One of the ways that you can do that in your process journal is to try to break down prior learning into those two different categories. So as you can see here, I like to use charts. So there's a little chart there, one part for your personal experiences, one part for your subject-specific learning. You can jot down specific experiences you've had or specific learning that you've done in school, And again, the important part, if you want to look at those top band marks, is making sure that you're discussing how is it relevant to your project. Not just a bullet point, I developed research skills that will help me to research, but be very specific. What kinds of skills related to research have you developed, and how specifically will that help you in this project? And you want to try to have a wide variety. Don't just focus on something like research skills, even though that's the example I'm giving you. Okay? Moving on, once you've kind of identified that and you've written that up in your process journal, it's time to start doing your research. Now, this is something I think that you all have practice with. Certainly in individuals and societies, you've developed a lot of these skills, but I will go over them a little bit in terms of the success criteria and how you're going to be marked for your personal project. So when we look at the research, to score excellent research, there's 3 kind of qualifiers here. That research needs to be extensive, it needs to be consistently and effectively evaluated, and you need to have a complete bibliography. So let's go through each one of those one at a time. So in order for your research to be extensive, there's a few things that you can do here. One, you want to make sure that you use a variety of sources. You know this from individuals and societies in any class when you're doing research. You don't want to rely entirely on any one source or even one type of source. Think about videos. Think about reading academic articles if it's appropriate. Think about how you might use textbooks from classes to help you. Interviews are often a really good source as well. The other big thing that I really want to stress to you guys is making sure that you're researching not only the topic, but also the specific product that you're making. If we look back a couple of slides when we were talking about fashion design, we're not just researching the trends, we're also researching how to design products. If you're writing a collection of short stories about women's issues, you're not just researching women's issues, you're also researching how to write an effective short story. So you really want to have that multifaceted research going on. And of course, as always, you want to make sure that you're using a variety of sources. So that covers the extensive part of things. The evaluation part, if you've been at Raha for a number of years, you've certainly practiced this in individuals and societies. If you're new to the school, this might be a little bit new to you, but the nice thing is you have support in your individuals and societies class to help you and provide you with additional resources on evaluating sources. So the technique that we like to use here is called OPVL. You certainly don't have to just use this, but it is one that, again, you've practiced in classes before. We talk about the origin. Where does this article come from? Does it come from something that's very reputable, potentially like a government website, or does it come from something that's going to have a bit more of a personal slant to it, like a blog or something like that? What is the purpose of it? Does it have an informational purpose, an informative purpose, and a persuasive purpose? All of these different purposes should be considered as it might allow you to kind of uncover bias that goes along with your article. Looking at the value, what value does this source add to your research, as well as the limitations. What kind of things is it not helping you with? Where is it confusing? Where is it not corroborated by other sources? To what extent do you think you can trust this source? So going through this kind of acronym is very important. The IB wants to see, as you can see below, that you are consistently and effectively evaluating your sources. Now that might not mean you're doing every single source. That can be very time consuming, but certainly you're going to need to provide a sample that you have done this for several sources. So certainly in your process journal, you're going to want to document this for several sources. The more the better, but again, it doesn't have to eat up all of your time. That's evaluating your sources. Finally, I think a simple one that we can just mention is you want to make sure you have a complete bibliography. The IB doesn't care what style it's in, as long as it's kind of consistent. So that can be APA, MLA, Chicago, whatever you're used to from classes where you're making bibliographies. And the nice thing is there's lots of websites like EasyBib that make this step very easy. So it's one of those things, just don't forget to do it. It's a silly way to kind of lose marks just because you've sort of forgotten to have your bibliography. So please make sure you include that. Okay, so that's the research section. Moving on to success criteria. Now this can be tricky for students because you're not really used to developing your own success criteria. Teachers are typically telling you what the success criteria are, and then you're sort of aiming for that. So now with your personal project, you get to decide how will you know if you're successful. And so there's a few different ways you can approach this. One is you might approach it by considering different areas of it, the form of your product or outcome, the function, the user and the audience, and the cost. Regardless, you might add other areas to this. You might not do all of those depending on your product and outcome. It might not be totally relevant, but it doesn't matter really necessarily, but you want to make sure that you have several criteria. You want to try to have as many different areas to consider, was I successful or not. Not only that, you also want to ensure that you have a test or method of evaluation to check and see if you were successful. So for example, one that typically pops up is you might want to make artwork and one of your criteria is that it's beautiful or pleasing to the eye. Now, how are you going to measure that? Do you just get to decide that, oh, well, I like it, so therefore it's beautiful? Or do you need to have some kind of survey? This is also true for students who are thinking about doing kind of informative presentations. If you're going to go into a class and try to increase their knowledge on a certain topic or to make them aware of some kind of social issue, how are you going to know if you really got through to them? So maybe a follow-up survey is a good way to sort of check with that. Either way, you need to consider both how will you know if you're successful and how can you measure that. So here's kind of an example of a filled-in sort of box. This is one way you might do it, where you've got sort of a bunch of prompts. You can reuse some of those if you think they're applicable, and certainly add more questions to tailor that towards your specific project or outcome. You can see the center column there is the specific criteria that you've decided on for some artwork and cost, etc. And then again, the all-important right-hand column of the test or method of evaluation that students will use to kind of see if they actually met their own criteria. So that can be a bit of a challenge. So again, feel free to loop me in or loop your supervisor in to help you think of different tests or method of evaluations to help you measure to what extent you were successful. That's a very popular layout that students put in their process journal. Another one that works that you're all familiar with is just making your very own rubric, where you can kind of consider, here's some potential categories. You can reuse some of these, maybe add some more, maybe not use all of them. And you can actually write out what would a level 1-2 look like, what would a level 3-4. So if you look at cost, for example, maybe a 1-2 is significantly over budget. Maybe 3-4 is just a little bit over budget, 5-6 you met your budget, and 7-8 you're actually under the budget. So you can consider also mapping it out that way for yourself to help you, again, measure that success as you go through the projects. Okay. Finally, just as kind of a reminder of how you're going to be marked on this, the IB wants to see that you're really pushing yourself with what they call rigorous criteria. Okay, so you need to clearly define specific characteristics of a high-quality product or outcome. So really consider all the different facets that would make what you're trying to do of a high quality. They also want to see that you're reflecting on your research, that your research is informing this, and that's why I stressed earlier that you need to be researching both aspects, not just the topic, but also the product or outcome itself. If you're making a video about student life, don't just research student life and the issues that matter to students, also research how to shoot an effective video. The IB is going to want to see that you're using that and you're commenting on how you kind of develop these success criteria from the research, okay? And you should, again, be able to justify these success criteria, have them specific and multi-dimensional, okay? That's kind of wrapping up for our video. So just kind of a reminder of your next steps based on this session. You're going to try to identify your prior learning and analyze how it's going to contribute to your success. You're going to do some research of both the product and the topic. And you're going to make sure that you're evaluating your sources using OPVL or something similar. If you've got a different technique you want to use, come see me or your supervisor just to make sure it's rigorous enough. And then you're going to use your research to help you develop your success criteria and the methods that you're going to use to evaluate your product or outcome. I hope you found this video helpful. As always, come see me, go see your supervisors, and I will see you all, even though I can't see you because you're a video, soon.